and welcome to Inside the Rookery. We are the four of us back together after, we tried to swap each other at the same time. Poor Andy Law and Mark, confused there as Andy Leask and I swapped over. So we are here today to talk about the art of design. We're taking it back to basics, back to the TTRPG books that we know and we love. Welcome to the stream. Andy Law, you haven't been here for a while, and neither has Mark.
No. Hello, I'm lovely to be back.
Hello.
It is indeed. I mean, it feels a bit weird. I've only managed, two in about the last 2 months or so because of various, reasons that we don't need details for.
Seagoat says, nice to see Mark back on the screens. Andy Law less so, but you know.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
And Jotun Art has finally made another stream.
Yay, good to see you.
Or Jotun. Right, so we've got lots of questions, as always, pre-submitted about design, about layout of books, etc. But as always, if you have anything extra or you've got any comments, pop them in the chat and I will bring them up on screen. I apologise for the quality of my camera. I am in production corner due to some connectivity issues, also known as, what did you call it, Andy? Please.
Aaron's Goblin Cave.
Aaron's Goblin Hole. Aaron's Goblin Cave, surrounded by cans of iron fruit.
I thought you were asking what I called connectivity issues, and I'm like, I would just call those connectivity issues. I don't understand the question. Sorry, that's my fault.
So, shall we get into the chat?
Oh yeah.
Let's. Right. So Seago asks a pretty a straightforward, hopefully. What program do you use for your layout and design, and would you recommend such a program for those who dabble as a hobby in creating their own works? Shall I go straight to you, Mark?
All right, if you like. Mark. Adobe InDesign. I can't speak as an expert on the industry and what and whether it's the best. It was the one I was told to learn, so I just got on with learning it. It's quite easy to pick up. It's sort of pretty friendly and fairly intuitive. So yeah, it's not the most complicated of Adobe software, but there's some. What I found challenging and interesting actually was learning about the aesthetics and the principles of layout and design, which they don't teach you as part of the software. Yeah. That's stuff that comes from experience, and if you happen to have friends who either work in the industry or, in my case, tutor at college level in design. That's Matt Keefe as an old Games Workshop buddy of mine back in the day, who can say, "Oh, you look at this and read this, and here's what I would do if I were you in this situation." But to pick it up and play with it, I found InDesign really good.
Yeah,
but I mean, Andy knows about it as well, of course.
Yeah, I had to learn InDesign because obviously I was producing books and I'd get a file over with all the goodies in it, and sometimes it was much easier for me to say do this, do this, do this, do this within the program than it was for me to sit on the outside, look at PDFs, go through it bit by bit, and then throw it all back, and then they do what they thought I was trying to say. It would come back again, where it was often quicker to just go bam, 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 done. There, I'm sending it back to you, Mr. Layout person. And clearly, I've screwed it all up, but that's what I want it to look like. And then they'll go, right, gotcha. And then they reorganized it or went, yeah, that's fine, save, export, or whatever. To take on the second part, though, if you're looking to dabble, I'm perhaps going to be deeply controversial here when I say, if you're just dabbling and building some quick, fun stuff, basic PDFs at home, something like Word does the job. It's super, super fast. Yeah. And it may not be professional standard, but if you're looking for something to very easily organize columns, pop in little boxes, do some little aside bits, that's more than good enough. Any free equivalent will also do the job. Online document creating, let's say Google Docs and similar, they're a little bit harder to finagle because you're very much stuck with whatever tools that they offer there. But something like Word does work really well, and that's got all the online options built into.
And I think, yeah, I was gonna say like less in terms of like Word document, but more in terms of like posters and that type of layout thing. Like a big shout out to Canva. I don't know if anyone's used
Canva's
that.
Good.
It's a free online one, but the good thing with Canva is, there's a free version. You can also pay for a better version. The nice thing is if you're a teacher, you can get the upgraded version for free, which is probably so that we do things like this and go, how great is Canva? But they're adding new features to it all the time. So it's got online whiteboards. So if you're doing online remote gaming and you want to have like a whiteboard space that you can use, you've got that built in. It's got video.
Everybody draw a penis.
Yeah, exactly. It's got video editing built into it now, which is like better than most sort of default video editors and stuff. And it's all available for free online. So it's well worth checking out Canva.
And there's a few suggestions in the chat there. Affinity Design from Jotun Art and Scribus.
Yeah. I will add, though, if you do intend to go semi-professional, InDesign really is pretty much not just the industry standard. It's pretty much the best I've ever used. It's just great. It does everything, but it has got a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. It's one of those things probably that I think when you start it, you spend a lot of time watching tutorials, and then you actually need to use those tutorials straight away to get to know it. And then once you know, and then would be hard to use anything else.
I mean, I have found myself going back to the original tutorials and go, oh no, hang on, I've got to do that thing now. I still don't know how to make when it comes to making the cover of the first book. I'm going to have to go, okay, how do I put the spine thing? How do I do that? I don't know yet because I haven't finished the cover.
Separate file.
Okay, there you go. Now I know. Separate file.
Yeah. I was going to say something else completely forgotten. Yeah, stuff.
And let's see, a follow-up question from Seagoat. Design and layout. There are several methods and schools for design layout. How do you approach design and layout for your own material? Me and Andy Lease, we just write shit, give it to Andy Law.
Yeah.
Or whoever we're working for. They do it
when right at the start, Andy Law and I went through 50, 60 PDFs of contemporary and ancient RPG books to kind of fill our heads and arrive at a sort of consensus about what we wanted our products to look like. And fortunately, we arrived pretty quickly at the same conclusions. We wanted clean, a little bit old school, easily navigated. I mean, back in the day, TT RPG books tended to be black and white with very little art because they didn't have the money to do anything else. And then when color printing became cheap, publishers and designers would just throw the kitchen sink at a book, and it was just every page was this heavy parchment, every header had to have a wood or ancient metal backdrop to it. You fill the margins with, and it just became just overwhelming visual stimulus. Where if you're as a GM and you're trying to find a piece of information in a book, it's like, oh God, where in all this do I find it? So we agreed from the beginning we wanted it to be clean. Both of us said black and white would be great, with maybe the odd spot of color here and there. But just again to echo that old school, to actually make it comparatively straightforward to produce, and also just because I personally love that sort of graphic hit of that kind of style too. And that's kind of been and once we just established that, it was just a question, okay, how do we ensure that it also just looks badass at the same time as looking, clean?
Yeah, if there had been a fly on the wall when Mark and I were trawling through many of the books, there would have been, I imagine, a lot of upset art directors out there. Some of the books were books I'd had my illustrations put into, and I'm like, oh, look what they've done to this. Why did they do that? Particularly when it's quite common in RPG books in particular to try and segregate different types of information out so that they're very easy for GMs to spot. That is a good idea. For example, if there's pieces of information that are telling you extra detail, they might put it in a box. If there's a piece of information about an NPC, they might put that in a different colored box or a different edged one or whatever. But some games take this relatively far. They might have 8 or 9 different box types, and that in and of itself isn't bad, but when they're all on the same page, because whoever's doing the layout doesn't have any control of the way the text flows through the book, they've just got to slot it all in, you're then left with some extraordinarily ugly pages. And that can sometimes really imbalance a product that might otherwise have absolutely gorgeous art, a lovely half-page piece sitting at the bottom, a nice little box, then blocking the top, and you're left going, well, you've got a boxed out bit in this half page, but it just doesn't look as good as it would have if you just had normal text streaming into there. Put the box on the other side. But they can't, because that's where it has to go for the logical progression of the book. Then they have to decide, do I put the art there or not put it there? But yeah, some of the books we just tore a new one because of many of the decisions that were made that were so easily resolved.
Yeah, that has been.
Multi-books.
Learning InDesign has ruined books for me. I can't look at them now and enjoy them because all I do is see the failings and the faults. And it's been one of the great things working as we are with such a small team, and the fact that the artist is also the layout guy and is in constant communication with the writers, so we can go, hey, can you chop a couple of lines off this because I've got a nice piece of art to go in there, or I got a blank space. Can you just write another paragraph to fit that because it really makes the pages look great? So I realized this morning that one of the staples for putting books together is usually the layout artist will have access to at least half a dozen pieces of spot art, which are just these floating bits of design, little graphic elements you can repeat throughout the book, and you just use to fill in empty spaces. And I realized we don't have any of those. We don't have any of them because we don't need them, because we've crafted the book in such a way that if there's a piece of art, it's relevant to the surrounding text and specific to it, which maybe explains why it's taken so bloody long. But anyway, not to have to rely on those space fillers means I think our stuff looks beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I was flicking through because obviously I've been playing role playing again in an attempt to cheer my mood up because I've gone through a health disaster. And the number of interesting layout choices that could have easily been resolved with a not just a spot art, but with a better piece of art. And you're like, couldn't you have just? Yeah, never mind. Can't help yourself when you look at it, particularly if you yourself have used the programs in question, as Mark says.
Yeah.
You're just left going, why?
Well, here's a last follow-up question from Seago on this set of questions, and then we'll get into some more of those actual specific layout issues. So Seago asks, design and layout, how do you have your layout judged to be good? Is it a simple case of letting others review it?
No, you're what the easy way is be an arrogant motherfucker and say, yeah, this is good. And just lean back, drop the mic, and go. This is the dog's bollocks done.
But there is something about layout.
I was gonna, isn't that the reason there's so many bad books out there?
What are you talking about?
Because they've all done that too. They've all gone. This is the dog.
idea what you're talking about.
I think we'll get into some of this later, because there's some really good questions from Kilishandra on it. But layout is something that as someone who consumes books, you kind of feel rather than know. So,
yes.
So I could look at books and say, yeah, I feel that's good, and I wouldn't know why. Whereas if Andy Law, I talked to you, you'd be like, right, well, what you were always saying to us on the Warhammer book, you can't write as much because we need some space on this page, and I was like, fuck's sake, make the art smaller, and you were like, get out of here, yeah,
leave the room,
leave the room, yeah. Can you even imagine? But that was something that. When you saw that particular core book, you felt that, like, yeah, I can see it needed to be able to breathe. It needed something, but I wouldn't have known what that was because I'm not a layout specialist. So I think, how's it judged to be good? Kind of readers, you'll feel more comfortable reading the book.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, often, I'll when I finish a page, I send it over to everybody else for review. If I finish a piece of art, I know when I started off, I would just send them the art. Now what I do is I send them the page the art goes on, or the spread that the art is part of, so they get a sense of how the whole thing flows. And sometimes I make some kind of fundamental mistakes because I'm noodling either on the art or the placement of the text and working out where to do the splits on the pages. Okay, shall I take the art off this page and have the text run all the way to the bottom, or shall I move that bit of text to the next page so I can fit a piece of art in there? Does that help with the flow, with the readability? Where do my paragraphs start? Where do my headers go? Do they line up nicely? Or am I starting a new section halfway down the page in the second column, which is always like, no, you don't want to do that. I want to start that at the top of the next page. Okay, well, what do I have to do to make that work? And you know that when you see a bad layout, it hurts me now physically.
Yeah.
Back in the day, you just look and go, well, that's weird. Why have they done that?
But there's so Jotun Art says there's a lot of pages that get overstuffed because producers get an idea in their head and refuse to change. But Mark, you and I have had conversations like that specifically about the sheet music, because there were certain things in the sheet music that
let me just call out so the people understand. We've got music in the book that we're doing just now. Several sheet musics. There are their own sections and handouts that can be given out.
Shall we just do it now that Josie Law composed for us? Happy 19th birthday today, Josie.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you, Josie. Happy birthday to you.
But we would go backwards and forwards, and I wasn't the composer, but I had access to the composition software. And Mark would say to me, "Oh, but it doesn't look good because of this. Can you fix that?" And I'd be like, "Well, no, I can't change that because that's like fundamental in the music.
The rules of music won't let me do that.
The rules of music won't let me do that. But I knew what the rules of music would let me do, and you knew what you wanted it to look like on the page, and it was a really interesting backwards and forwards. And then every now and then I would have to go back to Josie and say, actually, this whole thing doesn't work. Can you, now the composer, actually fix that? And it was a really interesting, I think that was a really interesting triangle.
Yeah.
And of course, Andy Law, you were the one that wrote the lyrics. So we also, I was like, can we just change, that?
No,
it all means something. So yeah.
No, I've actually written a code in that one. Get out of here.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm trying to do a little graphic design elements to make the sheet music, because they're handouts, so they're in-world artifacts. So I'm decorating the frames with narrative elements as well. I'm trying to fit those in around the music. Oh, and then I've got to take the finished sheet music and redraw it by hand so it looks like it's medieval fantasy, not contemporary, software. So yeah, exactly. Good times.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting kind of loop discussion of bringing people in that needed to do stuff, and more than you would think for just a few pages.
Shanties is what they are, right? Yeah.
100%.
So let's go on to one of Kilishandra's questions. So Kilishandra asked, as a dyslexic, I find 3 things impact my ability to read game books: font, column width, and paragraph size. Do you take things like this into account when writing and designing?
I'll do a quick ping on the writing side. It's something that's actually popped up a couple of times when we're also doing the layout, and Mark's like, I've got this paragraph that's too fucking big. And it's not just because it's too big to set, say, for example, in the column. It'll fit in the column fine. It just turns into this enormous block. And as we all know, some people find enormous blocks of text very difficult to parse. They're just harder. So I try to remember when I'm writing. I don't necessarily always do it, but I try to remember when I'm writing to try and ensure that each paragraph is never too long. And that's sometimes difficult to do, because when it does move over towards the layout side, you might find that the layout for a particular type of box or section has got a larger font. And because of that, what may have looked like it was a relatively short, easy to understand paragraph when you were writing it, suddenly turns into a far heavier block. And that's when you have to then go back to it and say, no, we need to break this up and rejig it. So I'll say that. My only other bit on this one is loosely, yes.
I had to be made aware of this, because initially when I started doing some of the layouts, I was doing a lot of paragraphs or sort of standalone little chunks, which might be number of paragraphs, and I go, I want this to span the whole page. I want to do a single column rather than, because the layout for our books or products is 2 columns, and I said, I want this to go right across the page, one big chunky column. And it was when everybody else pointed out, so that's can be hard for some people to digest. So we had to come to a compromise. Is it okay if I do a short paragraph right at the top, and then everything else is in the 2 columns? And we sort of agreed that that was fine. But so I was made aware of some of the concerns in that regard. So for sure, it's absolutely something we think about now.
And it's definitely something writing, like different types of writing, find that easier or harder. So if it's something like a consistent format, like say location descriptions, well, if we're always going to have a paragraph describing the outside, a paragraph describing how it's used, a paragraph describing adventure seeds, then you can keep those relatively small and chunked. And you can feel when you're like, I have written far more than I normally would in this paragraph. I either need to make it smaller, or this becomes a bigger write-up rather than but it is harder if you're in, like, say, narrative sections or things like that, where you're like, and then you start getting as well into the stylistics of it. If it's something that is meant to be read aloud and things like that, it's a constant. But that's the point. It's a constant process of revision, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And
I suppose as
Sorry.
well, just thinking what Mark was saying about the paragraph things, I guess this is not really something we as a company have really thought about, because everything we've been doing has been the sort of standard page size. But the size of the page it's going to be printed on has a factor on that, doesn't it? Because in advance of today, I was like sort of flicking through other RPGs that I had physically or in PDF that I thought had like nice examples of design and layout. And I was reading one called Lost Roads, which is sort of a post-environmental apocalypse type role-playing thing. It was part of Zine Quest a couple of years ago. Really, really good, beautiful book. But because it's Zine Quest format, like it's smaller, so a lot of it is just single column actually, but it's readable because the page is much smaller. And that was something I literally never would have thought of until I was confronted with it this morning.
Yeah, I mean, Mark called out, just to pull up what May Chen says there. Page spans, we discussed this quite a bit because, as Mark said, he had quite a lot of, I think this would really go swooping across the page under a lovely piece of art. That'd be great there. And then we can go double column over here, and artistically 100% spot on. But as you say, for some people that is almost impossible to read. I have a bit of that, and because my brain's a little bit mental in terms of how it tries to read. But what my brain tends to do is it just makes up words. Whenever a block of text becomes too wide for me, I don't read what's on the page. I just read what I think should be on the page. And my brain happily fills in words, makes shit up. And I reach the end and I've read a completely different paragraph to what's actually there.
Kalishandra's asking here, which you have kind of answered, Mark, because your layout was great, but you did change it. Have you ever changed a great layout or content order for accessibility reasons? Can we just say, if I put my head like right here, I've got ears that look like Batman's mask. I'm not going to move my head now.
Good call out, yeah.
Or Batman is standing directly behind you.
Oh, no.
Yeah, with the cape up to one side.
Yeah.
Love it.
The changing the layout fixer. Yeah, and honestly, it's something that we continue to do after we finish this stream. Andy and I are going to have a talk about white space and where I choose to break some columns and stuff like that, because apparently I'm doing it in an unconventional format, but it looks nice. But can I maintain it consistently throughout an entire book? So it's an ongoing discussion for us.
It is,
yes.
Yeah, and screen readers are a good point. So testing your content with screen readers is really important. I don't think we've done that yet, but we have done that on previous products that we worked on and taken feedback. And how we found out it was so important was we took feedback from people who used them, who said, this didn't work or that didn't work, and fixed it in the
I had to make a change in that recently, because one of the fonts we're using, as is often the case with slightly sort of archaic fantasy fonts, and we haven't gone mad with those, but the numerals are often a bit wacky and not that great. So I was substituting. I wasn't using the default 1. I was using a lowercase l because it looked more like a 1. But it was pointed out to me that screen readers will
we'll read it as an L.
I'll call it a specific example.
Yeah,
I'll call it a specific example in this one as well. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, in the core book, there's the careers. Careers are a very important part of how Warhammer works. And inside the career blocks, there's a bunch of stats that you have, and underneath them there was symbols to say which stats you could increase. Rubbish for screen readers. Immediately called out after the book went into its first alpha printout, where people were trying to read it, those who were using screen readers, and they'd be like, whimsical, blissical, blah, blah, blah. And then symbol, blah, blah, and it meant nothing to them, and they weren't sitting in the correct place. So they all had to be changed for numbers for a secondary PDF, which we released to support that. But there was another slightly more insidious reason, and it's closer to what Mark was suggesting there with the L's and the 1s. Throughout the course of layout, because there was some odd font choices, many of the letters had been replaced with a different font version, just to make sure that the writing popped and was clear on the page. But because of that, it meant that some of the words had extra spaces added to them, so the screen reader just to ensure that, say, for example, an italic word that came in had enough space before the next word, an extra space had been added, and the screen reader took it as a new sentence, and the screen reader completely bollocks that up in terms of actually reading it the way it was meant to be. But that was because of the layout option to put that little extra space in, rather than make it a wide single space that had a triple space or whatever. And similarly with letters that have been replaced with ALV ones. And I was blind to that because I also did it.
But that's actually a really interesting point about learning things exactly the way they should be. So, you know, if you think about the old way of typesetting and then turning that into layout and design, and then kind of just doing it, like learning it as you go and doing it instinctually, or like reading tutorials and then gathering it as you go along, that there will be things like that where the quickest solution that seems obvious is actually not like the correct solution from a professional.
Yeah, there's consequences to taking that kind of punk rock approach to layout.
And to add to what you were saying, Andy, about the career sort of symbols and stuff, like in terms of how the road to hell is paved with good intentions, like initially there weren't even symbols. Initially there was only going to be colors. But then we added the symbols because we realized that people who were colorblind wouldn't be able to see the colors.
Oh my god! Yeah.
So we fixed one accessibility problem, but then created another accessibility problem in the process. So,
Yay!
Yeah, but we're trying. We're learning. We're learning.
Foreshadowing issues that we will have before the end of the road of this one.
Okay, so what will we go into next? Another one from Kilishandra. So finding information during play is paramount when playing some games. What hints do you have for achieving this?
I'll go for the most obvious ones to open. Very clear headering. As a GM, trying to find a piece of information when you're playing the game often requires that core line at the top and clear access to like not more than 2 or 3 paragraphs underneath if you need to quickly scan down it. As a secondary, very clear separation of layout style for anything that the GM is meant to be immediately presenting to the players, whether that is a form of test or whether that is something that should be read out. If you do that, that covers the lion's share of the issues. All the rest of it is noodling and twisting and playing around. So that's my general comment, I think.
I mean, my suggestion would be buy the book physically to read it and then get it digitally to play with it. Because I find searching for information through a PDF is often much faster than leafing through books. Plus, you can snip, or because what I tend to do when I was doing it was I used OneNote to organize all my stuff, and I would literally just snip from the PDF the relevant bits. So if I'm doing a fight with, say, a troll, I've like got all the special rules that apply to a troll, and I've pasted all those rules next to it on my little OneNote, so I don't need to go flicking through the book. So what does it mean if it's size large, and how does regenerate work? Like I've got it all right there for me wherever I need it. And I know there are lots of paid for tools that will have that if you're playing online, but if you're playing around the table, sorting out yourself in advance is useful.
And I would do, if I'm using a physical book, what I do with my recipe books and what I do with some of my roleplay books, which is use those removable sticky notes that you can I've got quite neat little writing, so I can write on them to remind myself what they are.
We should do those, is that we should make Coil Crown branded post-it notes, effectively.
So people could do that.
Nice little parchment with a little rough edge, not bright yellow. Stuff like that.
You'll see why things take so long for the Rookery to do, because we keep on coming up with great ideas that we just have to add into the next.
Guilty.
Andy will take a note of it. We're all guilty of that.
Yeah.
That would be brilliant, though. I would love some Coiled Crown sticky notes for everything, for work.
Little crow notes, yeah.
Yeah, crow notes, yeah. On that note, there is a question about sort of about that. So RoboPapa asks, what do you think about using different font styles, bold, italic, to highlight the most important facts, e.g. in box text? I myself find it very helpful. And actually, maybe we just talk about box text and Andy Law, I know you've got strong feelings about what you use it for.
Yeah.
You're looking at me like, you do. You're always telling me about the box.
I have strong feelings about everything. I can't help it.
What do you think, Mark, about the font type to highlight facts?
Yeah, we do. Yes, we bold, we italicize. Yeah, we have red. We have, because we're black, white, and red is our basic color palette. So we'll have text or numbers in what I call Rookery red, which is a very specific color. But yeah, bolding, italicizing. I think we've only got three different fonts in the book. There's our sort of main standard font for the majority of the text, which I will use in italic, in semi-bold and bold. And then we've got a couple of for the sort of flavorsome stuff, and for the headers, I've got more kind of archaic text, and then there's the italic text for some of the box out stuff. But keep it fairly straightforward and fairly readable. And when we do switch to any sort of specialist text, it is to highlight something. It is for a very specific reason, to draw attention to it. So yes, I agree with RoboPapa.
I'll bring up a few comments before I go to the Andy. So Tiller says making stuff work on digital is its own thing. I made circa 50 character sheets for World Anvil now, and each had its own problems. Making it work with big screens and also phones via bootstraps and things, adding all the label for stuff for screen reader, etc. Seagull, this is controversial. Buy a second book and cut it up to extract the bits of information you need.
As a potential publisher of said book, I say buy 5.
No, you need 2 extra ones.
You've not been following the chat, Andy.
You need 2 extra ones because it doesn't work well when stuff is printed on both sides.
There you go.
Third book.
101
Colonel says, when I hear troll, I feel like singing trolling in the vein of Red Darts. I have never thought that before, but now I
can't get out of your head now.
Forever, I will.
Yeah.
May finds italic hard, and I know some people do find italic.
Me too. And in most cases, when I use it, I'll often run it through a semi-bold, because it just gives it a little bit more weight, and it just it gives it it feels when you sit next to the regular text, it has the same weight to it, the same body to it. So yes, italics can sometimes be a bit flimsy, I find.
We found that actually over on the Discord server, where there was a bunch of italic-y posts popping up, not calling it anyone in particular, but some people actually pinged back and said, I'm finding it very difficult to read their posts. And we were like, well, that's potentially something that we need to think about as well on our side. Not just for the books, but just for the accessibility of the Discord side of things as well. Because I got a ping from one person, who I won't say who it was, who was copying out the text, popping it into just Notepad, pasting it there to read it. And they were doing the same. And I pinged back, had a small conversation with that person. And they were doing the same things with some of the roleplay books when the italic sections came in, or when, again, the cross-page stuff was coming in. They just copy it out, drop it into a Notepad, thin it off, and it would just paste in there and be easy for them to read.
I think it is interesting, though, because it does feel to me to be something about the weight. If I imagine italics, it's like your eye gets used to a certain weight of text, and then the italics is slightly less weight, and so your eyes are like, what's happening?
It feels fainter.
And so it makes it feel fainter. Yeah.
And I think as well, if it's a serify font as well, that can get problematic when it's italicized, because everything's a bit busy as well. So I know for students I've taught with dyslexia, like that's been a big issue. Is it the way one girl described it to me was like, it feels tangled when it's in italics. So.
I absolutely. And again, it's one of the benefits of InDesign. If when we go through it all, or certainly when we get sort of physical printed samples, if we decide, actually that italic is a bit light, because with InDesign, it'll be a style, it'll be a paragraph style or a character style, and we decide, okay, we need to either up the font size on those, or we need to go to semi-bold or full bold. You just change the style, and it just changes it throughout the book. You're not even going to go, oh Christ!
And all the pages bump down because it's larger.
Well, hopefully not.
And we start weeping. Why are we even doing this?
Hopefully that doesn't happen.
Seagull says italics are lighter and thinner. My new diet regime is to make myself an italic.
The italic diet. Although you do have to walk, you do have to lean everywhere when you go.
Here's one that I'm not particularly familiar with, but Tiller says italics and small thin fonts do not go well. Look at Vampire 5th edition. That's hell to read. Apart from you're mixing up rules and lore throughout the book, it's the worst.
Yep, agreed completely. That's exactly the sort of thing that when Mark and I were going through the books, we'd be like, what the the fuck is going on here? Obviously, there was a clear design choice behind it. This is our main font. We will, in italics, use it for this. We will in bold use it for this. But no one just sat down and went, "Is that a good idea?"
And
they
I
just
wonder
looked at the core font.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not throwing shade at White Wolf or anything, but like because the earlier sort of World of Darkness things had layout problems as well, because they were terrible for white text on grey backgrounds and things like that. They were really hard to read. It does feel like they're always trying to go, oh, here's a shiny thing, without ever actually thinking, but is it readable? Does it actually look good on the page?
I find Warhammer 40k books terrible to read now. Small lettering and tools.
I will point out a small thing on small lettering, because I've been involved with a few books that were written with a specific font size in mind because of a specific length, but because of the nature of the collaborative building of these books, some people overwrote. They decided they were going to keep everything in place. Some people overwrote, and they decided to keep it all because it was so, yes, this is great, but it meant that instead of increasing page size, they decreased font size, and the book became so tight and so full. And it's a point where the editor should have just, well, not even the editor, because the editor is the one who's just sorting the text, but the overall producer or developer and looked at it should have just gone, hell no, this book is now a nightmare, and you need to be young to read this, and you need to be and have at the very least decent eyesight.
We're all here with glasses.
Yeah, quite. We're on the other side of that particular point. But yeah, some books became almost impossible, and when that's combined with a lovely parchment background,
that's it. God. Yeah, the noisy background, the background texture, and then you can drop a small font over the top of it. And I'm looking at these things going, did nobody go, this is really hard to read, particularly when it's a rule book. Where I need to access this information, quick in the middle of play, and I'm going, oh Christ! I mean, I need to turn a light on to be able to see. Let me put my phone light on so I can separate the text from the background a little easier.
It was a bit like
poor choice.
Like sort of closer to home. Like obviously James Wallace, who obviously regularly presents us, did his lovely board game book last year, and like most of it looks lovely, but many of those chapters have panels that are like yellow
with white text,
with white text, and it's impossible to read. Like literally, if I'm trying to read that in bed, like my bedside lamp is just not bright enough, and I like to taking off my glasses and holding it there, and eventually I'm just like, I'm just not going to read the panels. I'm just going to read the main text, which is a shame, but
yeah.
Oh, Martin Ironrook, you've hit my weakness. Acronyms, the fiction panels in some unreadable acronym were awful.
I can help. All flesh must be eaten. It's a zombie role-playing game. And Martin is 100%
I would never have gone for that.
Yeah, he's 100% right. It nigh on impossible to read. Really, really hard. It's a shame because there's some really good stuff in there. I think Graham wrote quite a lot of stuff for All Flesh Must Be Eaten.
Oh, thanks. Seagoat came to my rescue, but you'd already done it. So this is sort of a bit backwards because you've sort of started to talk about it, Andy Law, but let's go back and see if there's anything else to add. Sequel asks, what methods do you employ to tackle the page count issue? Excise entire swathes to a separate document, reduce all sections in word count until they fit, even though detail may be lost, or some other solution?
Okay, I'm going to drop in a couple of ones. The vast majority of writers I've been involved with massively overwrite. And you tend to find that your average 500 word piece could very easily be a 350 word piece with no loss of actual content. So the first step is careful and judicious editing. However, depending on the nature of the book that you're dealing with and the authors you're dealing with, that editing may not go down well. So you've got to be careful with that in step one. You'll find, though, that the vast majority of roleplay books, they're made for a particular word count. Away you go. And most of the writers are like, once it's out of my hand, it's probably going to get massaged into something else anyway.
And for specific, I was just going to say, Andy, for specific sections, there is actually a step even before the editing and all of that, and that is your outlining. So if you're writing if you're commissioning the writing for a specific type part,
that was going to be my next point. Yeah, you got ahead of me. So I tackled that directly when we were doing a lot of the Warhammery bits. Like, for example, I'd say, hey, Andy, I need 150 on this, 100 in this, 200 in this, 200 in this, 50 in this, 50 in this, 100 in this, 100 in this. And just broke the entire book down because I knew it would then definitely fit inside its page count. And I remember pinging over it was a 96-page book, pinging over the font and speaking to the layout person, and the layout person was like, what are you going to do if it's overcount? Do we need to do it? And I was like, if it's overcount, I fucked up. And that's fair. But I've given you enough art and spot art that you should hopefully be able to massage this into place. I did the layout and it came out on page exactly what I wanted. I wandered around like this, doing a happy dance.
and there's an extra level that was even cleverer than that, which is the actual limits for the sections were ever so slightly higher than the numbers that you told me, because you knew that even though you said 150, I'd probably give you 170. So yeah.
So
it was really
right?
frustrating. Yeah. So it was really good for keeping writing going, because like sometimes you're just faced with like a blank whole bit and you start, but then you kind of get lost in it. You don't know what to do next. And it was really good to be able to go, right, well, I'm going to go here and do this little section because I know he needs something on the trade routes into this town or whatever it happened to be. Yeah. So that it was actually, I thought initially that it would suppress creativity, but actually it was really, really helpful for keeping like the flow and the speed going. But I didn't realize to begin with how strict it was. And I would constantly be like, yeah, but can I just do, like, I've got so much to say. And I'd be like, no, stop. Yeah. Like, everyone is saying that, Lindsay. There's no exceptions for anyone. And we were in the room together. So, like, I could get that immediate feedback, real-time feedback. But yeah, it was an interesting experience.
So that's one way, but the vast majority of books are not made like that. It just doesn't work like that. You get yourself a word count, it goes in. Everybody has an expectation of approximately how many words will fit on an average page. It might be, say, for example, 700, 1,500, depending on font size, page size, or whatever it might be. So if you're doing a 100-page book and it's got a 700-page word per page expectation, then you know exactly how many words that you need to write to fill that book. And then you add your opening papers, your end papers, and away you go. And those word counts generally account for, say, a 400-word page, big page of half art, a 1,000-word page, a 1,000-word page, a 400-word page, and it all averages out in the end. So you tend to find, from the perspective of producing it, you've got a very clear idea of how big your book's going to be because you already know what the layout looks like on average. It in general, loosely works. But the problem is when it doesn't. And the number of books out there where they haven't just gone in and gone, well, it doesn't here, we need more pages, and instead go tight, are sadly too many. Another issue that we discussed at the beginning as well, which I will mention, is also the organization of where the bits of pieces of material go. Too many boxes being clumped together, for example, inside the text. That looks ugly as sin. So you've got to make sure those boxes are spread through. And a lot of writers, when they're just pulling it out and doing it, they're like, oh, that needs to be a box because it's that sort of information. And that one. And that one. I've done this myself. I'm as much of a criminal for this one. And then we're back into standard lines. And then it goes over to layout artists. And they're like, what the hell do I do with this? How do I make this not look shit? And often that's where spot art is deployed to try and break it out. Or they'll do one of the blocks there with a bit of art and then another block on the other one, where often the better idea would be to go back to the developer and say, oi, rejig this, just rejig it, because that's a mess. But they don't, because once it's over to layout is expected to make it work and then send it back. So the vast majority of book production for speed and expediency doesn't take that into account.
Yeah, no, I as layout artist, illustrator, graphic designer, and I guess co-creator, I'm allowed to turn around to Andy or Lindsay or either Andy and say, yeah, no, you need to, I'm not happy with this, you need to go and fix it.
Fuck off.
I'm not laying that out, you know, but that's the exception rather than the rule, you know.
It is.
And so Martine has asked, and we have mentioned white space a little bit through, so how important is white space for aiding the accessibility or presentation of a book?
I'll add a little bit on this one. Some of the most beautiful books I've seen made extraordinary use of white space, and then often people looked at those white spaces and went, oh, that's so great, we could then put shit in there. The number of books that I see, I'm thinking like, say, I think it was Nobilis, which had really beautiful thin columns with loads of white space. It made the books beautiful. As you're making your way through, it felt artistic, it felt gorgeous. And then I saw somebody that used a very similar layout, and we're like, well, now I can put stuff in there to say, oh, that's a little bit about that bit, and that's a bit about that one. And it just looked cluttered, messy, and uncool. You tend to find, because the role-play industry and gaming industry less so nowadays, but the books for most board games are tiny. But the role-play industry in particular does not have an awful lot of money. So they need to get an awful lot of information in often a very small number of pages. So you tend to find that white space takes a hit. The areas for the books to breathe. Warhammer, for example, had a bit of white space down the other side, which they slapped a repeating graphic, which was
still using that same bloody graphic I noticed the other day.
Are they? Huh.
Yeah,
there you go.
That one on every goddamn page.
That's
sorry.
That's a choice. A choice what they did make. And the white space, the breathing is good, but the utility of it and the presentation of it might not necessarily be so. So my general opinion is, yes, it's good. It's not necessary, but it does make your book look less cramped and just generally more accessible. One last point, actually, a lot of people who are dyslexic also find books that don't have the space around the text blocks very difficult to deal with. And so you have to make sure there's enough space between your columns and also to the edge of the page, just to ensure that those blocks don't bleed into other blocks around them. So that's worth pointing out on a more practical level rather than how it looks and how pretty it is level.
When we put out our first digital PDFs and we started getting feedback from them, I was so delighted, more delighted than people who like the art, that we got people saying, "Oh, I love the layout, I love the feel of it." For me, that was because this was a new area for me to be working in. I took a great deal of well, a mixture of relief and gratification from reading those things.
And in a way, it's interesting, Mark, to be both layout artist, graphic designer, etc., because you are like negotiating with yourself.
Yes.
You know, like do I want a piece of art here? And you're sort of balancing off, do I need one? Do I want to do one for here? Like, obviously you want to put more art in, but does it really need it? So
exactly. Yeah. Well, it's kind of being the artist and essentially almost like the commissioning art director, even though I'm commissioning for myself. I think, do I need to get Gibbons in to do more pictures, or can we just write a bit more text? And I need employ. I've got like a little folder of inky splats, because that's part of the style. I can drop an inky splat in there, and it means I don't have to do another illustration. And again, and if that then allows the page to breathe a little more, makes it a little more readable, and feels like we're not cramming stuff in, then everybody wins.
I've got visions of you being a little bit like Gollum in the Two Towers, having a conversation with yourself, going, "We want more art treasure, but we don't need it. But we want it."
Yeah, Gollum is the art director. Smeagol is the artist.
Yeah. And so Conquest Publishing says we have used the Open Dyslexic font as a separate PDF, and that's been well received. That's good to know.
Oh wow,
good to know. Yeah.
I've not considered doing that actually, largely because there's a part of me that's afraid that the font will be so massively different that it would make the entire book go chunk, 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 and it would end up being almost a second layout job. But yeah, I can see why that may work. I've not looked at the Open Dyslexic font for a while actually, because last time I looked at it, I found it fine, not necessarily great, but fine. I'd be interested to see what it looks like nowadays.
I mean, we just got Comic Sans, Andy.
Pardon?
I said just use Comic Sans.
Oh yeah, with papyrus headings. Yeah. Papyrus headings, Comic Sans, job done.
Seagoat says, I've got the Witcher RPG and D&D 5th edition player's handbook handy on the table. Comparing them, the Witcher is the better looking layout of the two.
I do find D&D fascinating because D&D is pretty much the standard for the industry. It's both exceedingly dull, but also kind of clean. It does its job well. It's clearly gone through so many different hands that it's come out the other side fine. their greatest addition, perhaps. Yeah, quite.
My copy of the this is the D&D when I started playing, and yeah, it's sort of it's
everywhere.
there's nothing there. Oh god, yeah. Look at the lack of bloody white space around that text. Look at it.
That's a crime, an actual crime. But D&D for me, the only thing it really did was standardize I'll do a torn image coming into the page, or splatted image, or ink splot image coming into the page, which other people took and often took further and did it far better. But it wouldn't have happened probably without D&D making it such a standard. But it does, however, mean that the vast majority of books these days that I look at are basically just D&D books. But not. Warhammer to a degree is just a D&D book, but not. The art styling that was used for that was torn edges across the top, which was just effectively simulating exactly the same thing that D&D was doing, with occasional corner pieces and half-page pieces that had the edges of it delineated by the content of the image rather than a hard edge. But that was about it. And it just bores me a little. A little.
Hieronymus Blaze says, sorry for the late question. That's no problem. But a masterclass in page design with InDesign or whatever might be interesting. Take that under consideration. Martin says, I really struggled with the Witcher RPG. To be fair, any RPG that scatters info in narrow sidebars occurs.
We do, something when I was playing around with the design initially, I thought, we'll do some little narrow sidebars. We'll leave nice wide margins. We do little bits of info down there, but we discarded that quite early on.
I'm laughing at this comment.
Well, see, when I fill in my official government forms in work, I fill them in with Comic Sans. I don't know
why that makes me laugh so much, but it really does.
And Tiller says the Black Void.
Giving it to the man.
Yeah, fuck that guy. The Black Void rulebook is awesome, and the small A5-ish rulebook is just awesome with transparent overlays and fabric bookmarks and stuff.
That is good. I'd like to give a shout out to Blades in the Dark, which we've talked about the system before. But again, I think the book is really, really nice in terms of it doesn't look like D&D.
Show us.
Well, it's not doing anything particularly funny, but the point is the world is entirely in darkness, all the time. So all the artwork is in that kind of grayscale, and it's just really evocative. I think, and it's a smaller book. It's a smaller sized book, which I think lets them do different things with the layout, which I think is why it works. I think it's why the character sections work, because the full page art is necessarily a bit looser because it's also dark and murky, but it's not too big because the full page that it is quite small. So. And also, I do have to give a shout out to the second edition of the One Ring. I think that is, in terms of how art and layout can kind of match the tone, like those two, I think particularly.
Yeah, the one I haven't seen Blaze in the Dark, but I feel like I should pick it up. But the One Ring, anytime I see a spread, a sample, I think, oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, it feels so Tolkien-y.
Yeah, Martin says recently the One Ring second edition feels like a real world artifact.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's
good
perfect.
job.
Yeah, that's what you want, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit of a balancing act, because if you end up doing too much of that, then you start to readability, accessibility starts to become a question. But if you can balance it, you can find that sweet spot. It's the perfect solution, I think.
I find the One Ring second edition a fascinating thing to look at, because I saw a significant chunk of the second edition when it was with its previous publisher, and the tonal difference and the art difference and the choices in terms of the layout are extraordinary in terms of the difference between the two of them. The earlier one, I'd say it was much more of a D&D style book, even though it wasn't presented in that fashion. The tone was running there and it was all the way through it, but it was so different when it was passed over to Free League. It, in terms of its general overall art direction, is leagues ahead, I think.
Free League's ahead.
But yes, totally. Can't believe I didn't think of that. Got it.
You set him up, Andy. I'll knock him down.
So Seago asked about art and layout. So I suppose there's a specific question for us and then a more general question for industry standards. So do you commission art to fill specific spaces in your layout, or do you commission art and then work the text around its size and shape?
I'll jump on this one. Typically, so first, I'll take the question as it lays out. So it's, do you commission art to fill a specific space in your layout? Now, the answer is yes, but normally it's standardized spaces, half page, quarter page, spot art, portrait, full page, and then possibly some non-standard piece that you might commission. Do you commission the art and then work the text around its size and shape? Broadly speaking, yes, but it's not so much that the art is commissioned to necessarily nestle in any particular place. What happens is all the art is commissioned according to, as we mentioned earlier, the how many averages, the average word count per page. That means we're going to have, say, one major piece of art every 4 pages. There might be a bunch of spot art to fill up gaps that naturally creates. So you then, if you've got, say, a 100-page book, that's 25 pieces of art to commission, plus a cover, plus spots. And on a game line, you typically have a bunch of spots that have been created from the beginning and just work all the way through anyway. So you don't need to do any extra spots that often. Every other book or so, you might add a few extra spots that are relevant to where the new game line direction is. And that's about it. So all the art is commissioned quite separate from layout. All of the writing is commissioned quite separate from layout. Then they're thrown at the layout artist. And typically the developer will go, yeah, my job's done, bye. And then it'll just sit there while the layout artist goes, how the hell do I make this work? If it's been well designed in terms of the build out from the developer, they'll have a relatively easy job just streaming all the text in, dropping the image in, which changes the stream of text throughout the book. And then eventually they go, I'm done, and it'll hopefully be at the correct page count. And then if it's not, that's when the developer starts fretting. Often by saying, hey, layout artist, what? So loosely, the commissioning of art and the commissioning of the words are completely separate from each other.
Can I ask a question? Has it always been like that, or is that a more recent development? Do you think?
For me, if I go back to my Games Workshop days, it was always quarter page, full page, half page. And the corner piece feels relatively recent because you couldn't until you started doing layout in books digitally. It would be such a massive pain in the ass to cut the lines of text and glue them down around a picture. So that's a relatively recent addition.
Yeah. I was more meaning in terms of like the commissioning being sort of separate to the writing, like not necessarily following after the writing.
Loosely, yes. And by that, I mean, you're right in that if it was, for example, someone's fan project or whatever, typically they'll write it all first and then they'll get some art that they add in afterwards. But when it's being mass produced by any medium to larger studio, they know exactly what the book contents are going to be anyway. And away they go. Now, when I was, say, working on the Warhammer books back in 2nd edition, the typical process was writing was done first, and then the writer did an art order at the end, which was generally ignored by the art director. But it was done. And it was generally ignored because art direction from a writer is generally, I have my 12 favorite characters that have to be in this image. And they have to be on a boat, and it's got to be in the sky, and there's got to be 12 other elements as well, because if they're not in there, it's wrong. So yeah, don't get writers to do your art notes. It's always a bad idea. So that was the step. But as it developed onwards from that, there was often an awful lot more control over the writing process and what was going to be in it. So art got commissioned earlier and earlier and earlier in the process. I'll say one flip on that. A lot of the companies that I've worked for over in LA, and there's been a significant upswing of LA role-playing games, Hunters Entertainment, Critical Role, all the rest of it. A lot of them will commission art way early in the process because they've got a very LA view of how art should be used.
Concept art.
They view it as concept art. They view it as something to inspire their writers rather than something that is necessarily illustrating their book. That's changed of late. The most recent books I've seen often coming from them, it's the standard text in place. They definitely know what's going to be art, layout, and away you go. But we
are turning all that on its head, though, of course, because we're doing art, layout, and writing all simultaneously, right down to the wire. Which is madness.
I
think we'll have a beautiful book as a consequence.
Yeah, but it'll definitely lead to, because what I was thinking, Andy, was I was contrasting in my head 1st edition and 4th edition Wifrip, and like how in Wifrip we had the issue where we were having to write careers, and the art that was going with that career didn't match the career because they had things that character shouldn't have, and all the issues that caused. But then I'm flipping that back
mighty ones.
all the little illustrations in Wifert 1, like the one we've spoken about before, my favorite one, the protection from rain spell illustration. There's just a tiny little, black and white line drawing of rain and like one person protected from that rain and it not following them, and their mate
With a big smile on his face,
just looking at them like that, looking grumpy. Brilliant. Look, but you're like, that's like a petty spell. Like either that art existed and whoever wrote that spell was like, I'm gonna, or somebody saw that spell and had the funny idea of a little funny illustration.
That was Anthony Reynolds. Not Anthony Reynolds, pardon me. What's it? Name escapes me suddenly. Tony Ackland. Thank you, Tony Ackland. They were pretty much. He would pull out like 7, 8, 9 illustrations in a day sometimes. Particularly when he was doing the miniatures, he just pile them out because back then the miniatures were illustrated by illustration. But the fantasy roleplay ones, they were just done to spec all the way through, and often on a day-to-day basis. Because they were sitting in the same office doing the same thing.
I suppose that's it. If you've got an in-house studio of local artists, it's much easier to do that. Yeah.
Seagoat gets the last word because it's almost 8 o'clock. The reason
already
for that question was I listened to an interview with the original art director for Star Wars line from Fantasy Flight Games, and they had a nightmare in trying to fit the art into the text, often having to recommission new art post-text layout. So there you go.
Not a surprise. And also, I'm not going to say Star Wars may have been a game that I was referencing earlier without actually calling it out, but it might have been because, my goodness, some of its layout issues were pretty transparent in places.
And I wonder if that's why now Fantasy Flight are constantly recycling their Star Wars art.
Maybe
because in their newer games, in their newer games, all the art is art that has existed in their older games. So
yeah, it's also cheap.
Right, he says Seagoat. No, Seagoat gets the last word when Seagoat gets the first word. So Seagoat was here first. So
Seagoat is the Ouroboros of
the end and the beginning, the alpha
and the omega.
So thank you so much for joining me today. We got through almost all of the questions, but I'll save them in a folder for if we have a chat again and we can bring them in because there's a few interesting ones in there. Next week we are meeting Adrian Tchaikovsky, I believe, to talk about his work.
Really Someone's happy.
I'm very excited by that.
Andy is very excited by that. Yep.
It's been in the background of all the streams right there.
It has. And until then, please like, subscribe, share, check out our Discord community, check out the Patreon. Thank you, as always, to our patrons and to our viewers for jumping into the chat and making these streams as fun as they are for us.
You're all the best.
You are all the best.
Yes,
until the next time, all that remains to say is goodbye and caw-caw, caw-caw.
Ta-ra.